Taming the High Cost of College, Episode 64.
You have kids, they grow up, and before you know it, it's time to plan for college.
Where do you start?
How much is it going to cost?
Will you qualify for financial aid?
Should you be looking into scholarships?
When will you be able to retire?
What about student loans?
The list of questions is never ending. The good news is, all the answers are right here. Welcome to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Here is your host, certified financial planner, Brad Baldridge.
Hello, and welcome to Taming the High Cost of College. I'm your host, Brad Baldridge. Today we have an interview with Joie Jager-Hyman. She's the author of B+ Grades, A+ College Applications. And it's a great book to help families in the college admissions process. I talked with Joie today about all kinds of different areas as far as testing and planning and what a typical student might want to be doing, especially if you're considering some of the higher end name brand schools, the Harvard and Yale and Ivy League, or even if it's kind of the second tier or the NYU and Boston College. She has a lot of great advice, and we kind of go through the whole timeline and talk about all kinds of different strategies that families need to be aware of. All right, as always, show notes are available at tamingthehighcostofcollege/64. Let's go ahead and jump into the interview. All right, today we're sitting down with Dr. Joie Jager-Hyman. She's the author of B+ Grades and A+ College Application. So she's got a great book out there. Welcome, Joie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on. So obviously you get involved in the college admissions process. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you came to do what you do and why you wrote your books and some of those things?
Sure. So I worked in admissions at Dartmouth College. That's where I went. And when I was about to graduate, they sent around a flyer to the seniors and said that there was a position in admissions open. So I applied and I got it, and I thought it was fascinating. I really enjoyed traveling around and seeing the different high schools and reading these wonderful applications. I think my inner age might be 17. I think it's a great time of life, even though it can be stressful. It's really the first time when you're making decisions about the type of person you want to be and the type of things you want to study and the type of things that interest you. But I didn't really have a stomach for sending out all those rejection letters. So I went to get my doctorate in education at Harvard. And that's when I started working privately with students. And I found my calling in that. I really love to get to know students and families and sort of help shepherd them through the education pipeline and eventually into hopefully the college of their choice, the college that allows them to thrive. So that's how I got into it. I've written a few books. I'm also a writer. My new book is, as you said, B+ Grades, A+ Applications. And that one is really for the good students who don't necessarily get the top billing from guidance counselors, but they're good students and they want good options and students who are not necessarily well served all the time by their high schools.
Well, great. So I think there's a lot of people out there that are trying to figure out what it takes to get into some of these higher end schools. Can you give me an idea of what a typical student looks like that's pursuing and being successful?
It truly depends on the school, but they are looking for somebody that will have an impact on their campus, right? So I think maybe a generation ago, being well-rounded was the way to go, kind of being good at everything. And now it's much more about being able to put together an application that really answers, what will this kid do here? What makes him or her different? How will he or she contribute?
Okay. So if I'm looking at some of the higher-end name brand schools, how do I choose from among them? Or how do you recommend people decide on whether they should pursue it? And if so, which ones?
Well, you have to be realistic, right? So first of all, you have to be honest with yourself about what your academic record is, what your numbers are. At some point, even though I think a lot of the rhetoric around this talks about how they're looking at the whole student and they're not just looking at SAT scores. There are numbers and it is comparative, and every college wants the best quote unquote kid they can get academically. So your first thing you need to do is see, is this realistic? I do see a lot of people setting themselves up for disappointment or wasting their time when, they're really not in academic range of the schools that they like. But assuming that you are, then, a lot of it has to do with visiting and researching. It's always great to talk to real students or alumni who've actually went, not necessarily only the tour guides or the admissions people who are paid to sort of sell the school. But starting early and doing research is important. Visiting, speaking with real students, that all can be helpful.
Okay, so I think I work with parents occasionally that fall in that kind of unrealistic, especially early on, right? You're the parents of a sophomore or junior, and you're saying, "Oh, my student's interested in going to Harvard or MIT or Caltech or whatever the high end school is," and then you look at the grades and you see, "Oh, well, gee, they got a lot of B's, a few C's." I don't, hate to burst your bubble, but it's probably not an accurate path. So,
Right.
how do you recommend parents figure out, the academic range, I guess is what you called it. So how do you know what that is, and what's an easy way to compare yourself to the colleges? Or maybe it's not easy, I don't know. But how would you go about that?
For sure, the test scores are the most convenient, right? So they all publish their test score ranges. They'll publish typically the 25th to 75th percentile, and that range is true. You just have to be aware that on the lower end, there are certain students that often fall into those categories, athletes, for example, and some others. So if you don't have a hook, if you're not at all connected with the school, if you don't have legacy at that school, you should probably estimate that you kind of need to be at least in the middle, if not in the top higher end of scores. Then there are the grades. The grades are also very important. And usually they'll publish some information about that. But to be fair to the colleges, one of the difficulties is that they're really looking at international applicant pool. And it's hard to completely, to communicate what they're looking for in terms of grades, because every high school is different. Some high schools have a GPA scale of 7.0, most have 4.0, some have 5.0, some do it in terms of numbers, not letters. And so, sometimes you just have to call or visit and just ask, they'll give you some indication. They looking for the, top 5%, top 10%? It's a little bit harder to discern with the grades, but the test scores are very easy and convenient. It's that information's front and center.
Okay. So as you're pursuing these schools, do you need to visit? And if so, why?
I understand it's hard to visit every single school that you may be applying to, and you don't need to. I mean, you definitely need to visit a school that you enroll at. But if it just so happens that you are interested in a school on paper because it has your major and because you've heard good things about it and you can't get to campus, you can still apply. Many schools do document what they call demonstrated interest. So they do want to see that you are likely to attend. And one of the ways that you can show that is having visited. But if you absolutely cannot get to a school, you can also email them and say, I couldn't actually visit, but I'm still very interested and here are the reasons. So there's some other ways to demonstrate interest without visiting. Ideally, yes, we would visit every college that you're interested in while they're in session. But the truth is, high school students need to go to high school, and the best way not to get into a good college is to just cut all your classes because you're looking at colleges. So you just have to find a balance of, trying to start early, trying to visit schools when they're in session. But if there's something that piques your interest for whatever reason, you can still apply if you haven't visited.
All right. So you just said start early. I think that might mean different things to different people. So can you quantify that a little bit?
I'm a believer in maybe, a couple visits even in 10th grade. That being said, it depends on the student. I do know some students where that idea of looking at colleges so early really does stress them out. I think if you're, somebody who likes to do research, this is a very big investment. It is a very big financial investment as well as an investment of time and resources. So making sure you give yourself time to visit and look and spend time on these campuses is a wonderful thing if you can do it.
Right. So you start visiting, say, in the sophomore year then a little bit, and then what happens? Can you give us the rest of the timeline as far as what, if you're working with a student and they're saying, my goal is, these 5 or 6 name brand schools, what's your goal as far as timelines and deadlines that you think make sense?
In terms of what? In terms of visiting or in terms of?
Well, when do you visit? When do you apply? When do you start working on your essays? Give us a general timeline, because I think a lot of people, myself included, say people start too late. They should start earlier.
Yeah.
But that's where the conversation ends. So a parent that hears that has a sophomore, let's say, they will say, yeah, I should start early. So I'm going to start at the beginning of my senior year.
Right.
Well,
Okay, now
that's, and you and I know that that's probably not early,
right.
but
So in terms of visiting, I mean, I think even, sophomore spring is a nice time. If you live near a college campus, you can take a drive over, somewhere local. It doesn't have to be your first choice school. It can be whatever's convenient. I do think actually the August before junior year is another good time to start visiting. Then, weekend trips, Columbus Day or the February break or April break, planning out junior year is typically when people see most of their schools. You can visit the summer after junior year if you need to. And like I said, it's very hard to get to every single school when they're in session because you still need to go to high school. Junior year is also the time that if sophomore year, I think is a time when you should start thinking about your testing calendar. If you're going to take subject tests, you should plan ahead for that. Junior year, again, you should really try to plan to space out those tests. I advise studying for the SAT or the ACT the summer before junior year to start, at least to get your test prep plan, to get your, if you're going to work with a tutor or a course, you definitely should have a strategy for preparing because those tests are very important. And then junior year also is when you're most likely going to be forming the relationships with teachers that will be writing your recommendations. Those are very important. That's something people don't think about often. Summer after junior year is when I start the applications, believe it or not. I want everybody to go back to school with at least the Common App and their early decision application done. I think people completely underestimate how long it takes to put together a good application. And senior fall is a super busy time for most students also. They have their most rigorous courses. Often those grades still count, or at least you have to assume that they'll count because you won't hear back from an early decision or early action school until December. So you have to assume that they'll count. You have to assume that, you'll be sending those grades to all of your colleges. And oftentimes students are still taking one last test or things like that. So getting those applications, getting an early start is critical.
Okay. So you mentioned subject tests and test prep and that kind of stuff. How often do people take ACT or SAT, and should you take both? And how much do you spend on, how much time and effort do you spend on subject tests? What's a typical plan as far as which tests and how often? And
it really depends. If you think you're going to be applying to highly selective colleges, you should have the SAT or ACT and at least 2 subject tests, right? That's a very, very small group of schools, though. Most schools do not require that. But if you think you're going to be in that category, then you should go for it. And then some schools get even more specific, like MIT would want math and science and things like that. So, 10th grade is when you should sort of start looking around and seeing what you might need. You obviously have room to change your mind, but you want to be prepared. You don't want to be caught off guard.
Right.
You don't need both the SAT and the ACT. You truly do not. They take either one. So you should, the SAT is changing this year, so we don't have as much data on what it will be. We only have what the College Board has told us about it versus actually seeing the new tests. And I always advise students to plan for 3 test dates working back from the early decision, early action deadline. So that's the November 1st deadline. So work back from there and give yourself 3 test dates. The reason is colleges really do favor, it is a climate that encourages multiple test taking. They almost all will take your highest composite score, and many of them will super score, meaning that they mix and match the sections of the test. And the reason they do that is it's because it's good for them, right? So U.S. News and World Report and their alumni and all the different, external, the media, everybody is looking at what your SAT and ACT averages are. So they want to pump those up. And that's why they will give you multiple times to take the test. And often they'll even mix and match the sections of the test so that they come up with a new score, which is your highest score. So the tests are important. And I know you're very much involved with getting merit aid. And the tests are about the best thing you can do for that, getting good test scores.
Right. I guess I haven't heard much about subject tests, so I want to dig into that a little bit more as well. So how do you know if a college is going to require a subject test? Do they make it obvious somehow on their website or?
It's very front and center.
Okay, so.
And that's just the most selective colleges require them. But basically, anyone will take them. They're always good to demonstrate mastery of a subject. They're always impressive if you can do well on them.
Okay, but then there's 20 or 30 or 40 colleges out there that require them, and they put that on their website?
Yep.
And if you don't have them, they're just not even going to consider you?
Yeah, they're required. Sometimes they're strongly recommended, which means, maybe if you're being recruited for football, you don't need them, but most students do.
Okay. Well, great. That's good to know.
And there's a little bit more flexibility with those tests because they're not as public as the SAT or ACT. Also, there's, so if you have to submit two, you submit two in the subject of your choosing typically. So it's not as directly comparative because if somebody's submitting math and chemistry and someone else is submitting history and literature, there's a little bit more wiggle room in terms of the admissions officer's discretion of how much they're going to make those tests count. Good subject tests are just good, one more good thing, one more good piece of data that shows you're smart. If you have weaker subject tests and stronger ACT or SATs, that might be okay because the ACT and the SAT is really the core of the testing package. And that's, again, the public data that they share.
Okay. So is there ever a time when taking multiple tests, especially like SAT or ACT, is going to hurt you? I mean, at the highest end schools?
It depends how many you take. If you're taking 5 or 6 and, at some point it does, the results get a little bit watered down. Technically speaking, they still take the highest score. So it also hurts you in the sense of, look, at some point you've kind of done as well as you're going to do. It's better to focus on grades or activities or something, something else that will be meaningful instead of just, being really focused on those tests.
Okay. So let's change gears a little bit. If I'm the parent of a student that's, working hard on applications and trying to figure this all out, what's my role as far as, should I be reviewing essays? Should I be making the rule that, you got to sit here Sunday afternoon until that essay is done? Should I be, how involved should I be and how can I help?
Yes, I'm going to be honest. Some parents are good at that if they're good writers and they're able to work with children. Some are not. And I think ideally, if you can swing it, and sometimes it's really bartering with a friend who's an English teacher or a writer. Sometimes it's hiring somebody. I think it's really great to not work directly with your own kid. I have children and I do this for a living and I have a ton of expertise and I'm not planning to do this with my own children. I've just been around so many teenagers and parents. And I realized that it's not even about the ability, because obviously I believe very much in my own ability to help students. Sometimes it's about, the dynamics of the parent-child relationship, especially the teenager child-parent relationship can get a little bit murky and sometimes make this process not so pleasant. That being said, if you're not in a position where you have any other adult who can help you, then yes, you should be involved. Students really should not be doing this 100% on themselves. I really don't think that they have the ability to gauge how much work, if they don't have somebody guiding them, it's very difficult for them to really know how good is good and how much work they should be putting into this and how much they should be pushing themselves and how they should be, how many rewrites they should be doing. So I do think it's, pretty crucial that an adult help. And if possible, not the parent. And it's not even because I think parents are not good writers or they're not, I just think I've just seen this go bad for a lot of people because sometimes, teenagers don't hear what you're trying to say. So if you're being helpful and you're making a good suggestion, they might hear, mom doesn't like my essay, or mom doesn't think I'm smart or whatever it is. So it's a luxury, but I think having a third party involved, and maybe you can, like I said, maybe find a neighbor to barter with or something. But
right. So aunts and uncles might be a good.
Yeah, anybody who's not mom and dad. It could be another relative. Another relative would be fine.
Right. I see that as well. I'll talk with parents on the financial side of things, and we'll be talking about, again, as an example, for a lot of families, when the student said, I'd really like a laptop. Next Christmas, a laptop showed up, and I'd really like an iPhone, and on their birthday, an iPhone showed up. So now parents have kind of trained their kids, and now kids are saying, I want an expensive college education. And they assume on Christmas or birthday, it's going to show up. Yeah. And to them, they don't really understand the difference. And it's really hard for mom and dad because they've given that lecture about how expensive that iPhone is, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't lose it. And how expensive that laptop is, and I appreciate you didn't destroy it. But now you have that lecture about, well, college is really expensive, and I think it just falls on deaf ears when it's coming from mom and dad. Mm-hmm. So sometimes having an outside party in that conversation is useful as well, whether, grandparents or brothers, aunts and uncles, those kinds of people.
Yeah.
All right. So if we're working hard and trying to get all this done, is there a particular deadline that we need to adhere to? I mean, if they say that the essays or the application is due November 1st, does that mean we submit it October 31st at 11:42 p.m.? Or do we need to be in a week early, or what? Does it matter?
The deadline is the deadline. Obviously, some schools do look at when you submitted and, they take note of that, but I wouldn't sacrifice quality just to get in early. So the thing I realize is that you really do want to sleep on these things. You want to, work early, work smart, and then maybe put them away and come back to it, because you never know what you'll see when you're looking with fresh eyes. So, look, you don't want to get it in the day of the deadline, but you don't need to, again, sacrifice the quality of it just to get it in early. The most important thing is giving yourself enough time to live with it, to sleep on it, to maybe show it to a couple of other people. Consider any edits, consider their suggestions. Like you really, this is something that you should really work on more than you've worked on anything else. You should really, really give yourself the best shot and give yourself the most time to really consider different opinions, different points of view. Is what you're saying coming across? Is what you're saying important and interesting? Does it represent you? It's harder than it looks.
Right. Absolutely. So I guess on that theme, are there areas of the application that you think a lot of students fall down on, or can you give us some tips to,
I think the biggest thing that students overlook are the recommendations. Now, obviously that's not within their control in the sense that they're not writing those recommendations. But I do think they're not being proactive enough necessarily in terms of, talking to the teachers, talking to the guidance counselors, really making sure that, they're coming across, that they're being proactive in terms of, having conversations about what their goals are and what they think their strengths are and the things that potentially they would want colleges to know. Those are really, really important pieces of the application that most students just completely tune out on.
All right. Well, let's back up a little bit then, because I think that might be what specifically is a recommendation, first of all, and do all colleges require it, or many, or what? Tell us a little bit more about recommendations.
Typically, selective college will require a recommendation from a guidance counselor and one or two teachers. The guidance counselor recommendation really is to sort of give context for that student in terms of his or her class. So a little bit, just academic information what you're, are you 10% or 5% or 25%? But also, like, are you thought of as a leader? Are you somebody? How are you known in school? What is your sort of overall reputation? Or how are you well regarded? Are you beloved? Are you somebody who, makes time for other people? Are you somebody who's giving back? Things like that. Teacher recommendations really should be talking about the student in the context of his or her class, right? So what are you like in the classroom? Are you raising your hand? Are you going home and reading articles on what we've discussed and then bringing them back and having, thoughtful conversations about that? Are you somebody who goes out of your way to help another student when he or she doesn't understand the material? Those kinds of things. So the recommendations are letters, but there's also forms that go with these recommendations that almost nobody looks at, but they're very important. And on those forms, there's, for the teacher recommendation, there's a grid and one axis. It's all kinds of qualitative categories like emotional maturity and reaction to setbacks and academic, intellectual curiosity, things like that. And then on the other axis, it's one at the top I've ever seen to below average or everything in between. So you do want to look at that checklist and think about that. Who is really going to say that you stand out, and who's going to say that both in writing and on this form that they have to fill out.
Okay. How do students typically approach their teachers or guidance counselor? Are there strategies to?
I like to put things in writing. So some teachers who are more sophisticated will actually have forms and ask the students to fill them out, but others don't. Although they want to help you. So I think maybe once you ask them in person and they've agreed to do this for you, it's a good idea to send them an email with, of course, to thank them. That should be front and center. And then maybe, highlighting some of the things that you enjoyed in the class, some of the work, or the assignments that you thought best represented you, any memorable work that you did. That really, for most teachers, they want to do a good job. And providing them with those details often does help them write the best letter they can.
All right. And so are there things you might be doing as a sophomore or junior then, if you think you're on this path, as far as maintaining relationships with teachers or the school counselors or?
Yeah. I mean, making sure that you're somebody who is contributing, frankly. You want to be somebody who is saying interesting things, being helpful, participating. It's great if you're smart, but if you're not using your powers for good, as they say, then you're not going to be as attractive to colleges.
All right. Well, great. Well, I think we've starting to need to wrap things up. So I guess before I let you go, can you tell us a little bit more about your books and other information where people can get a hold of you?
Oh, sure. Well, I have 2 books. The first one is called Fat Envelope Frenzy, and it's a narrative nonfiction book following 5 kids applying to selective colleges. And the second one is B+ grades, A+ applications. And that one is more of an advice book for those good students, like I said, who want to go to good colleges, but are often potentially overlooked because they're not necessarily applying to the Ivy League. And I also have a company called College Prep 360, and we work individually with students, and you can find us on the web that way as well.
All right. Well, I got a lot of great information, and hopefully our listeners will go ahead and track you down if they need your help, and certainly read your books. Any last thoughts?
No, just good luck to all of you out there who are going through this. I know, especially this time of year, it can seem very stressful, but it really does work out.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you very much, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. I hope you learned a lot. That was a great interview with Joie. Hopefully you go out and check out some of her books. I think there's some great information available out there. As always, we appreciate reviews at Amazon.com. And please share this podcast with anybody you know that might be going through the college process. That's all we have for today. We will see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Now it's time for you to take action. Head to tamingthehighcostofcollege.com for show notes, bonus content, and to leave feedback for Brad. The next step on your college journey starts now.
Brad Baldridge is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research and an investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, a registered investment advisor. Securities are offered through Cambridge Investment Research Incorporated, a broker-dealer and member of FINRA and SIPC. Brad owns 2 companies, Baldridge Wealth Management and Baldridge College Solutions. The Baldridge companies are not affiliated with Cambridge Investment Research.